They say that blood is thicker than water, but they never tell you that gold is heavier than blood. As I lay in this cold, sterile hospital bed, listening to the rhythmic, lonely beep of the heart monitor, I realized that the two men I gave life to had become strangers. I am the man who built an empire from nothing, the father who skipped meals so his sons could feast, and the provider who paved their roads with diamonds. But today, as the doctors discuss a surgery I might not survive, my phone sits silent on the bedside table. My sons, the heirs to my legacy, didn't just forget me. They abandoned me the moment they realized I had nothing left to give. I remember the look in their eyes when I told them the business was failing. It wasn't pity. It was disgust. This is not just a story of a father's love. It is a warning about the darkness that grows in the hearts of those who inherit everything and sacrifice nothing. If you have ever believed that family is an unbreakable bond, prepare yourself. Because my story will show you how quickly that bond dissolves when the money runs out. It started 40 years ago, in a small, dusty workshop on the edge of town. I was young, ambitious, and driven by a single goal: to ensure my future children would never know the sting of poverty. I worked 18-hour days, my hands stained with grease and my back aching from labor. When my sons Arthur and Leo were born, they were the center of my universe. I remember holding them for the first time, promising them the world. I kept that promise. As my small business grew into a multi-million-dollar corporation, I made sure they lacked nothing. They attended the finest private schools, wore designer clothes, and spent their summers on yachts in the Mediterranean. I thought I was giving them a head start, but in reality I was unknowingly feeding a monster called entitlement. I never asked them to work for what they had. I simply handed it to them on a silver platter, believing that my love would be enough to teach them gratitude. As they grew into adulthood, I brought them into the company. I gave them executive titles and corner offices they hadn't earned. Arthur, the eldest, was polished and charismatic, but he lacked the grit required to build something from the ground up. Leo, the younger one, was more reserved but developed an expensive taste for luxury that far exceeded his contributions to the firm. I watched them walk through the halls of my company with an air of ownership, looking down on the very employees who had helped me build the foundations they stood upon. I chose to ignore the red flags. I ignored the way they spoke to the staff, the way they spent company funds on personal whims, and the way they looked at me, not with respect but as a temporary obstacle standing between them and their full inheritance. Then, the market shifted. A series of bad investments, coupled with a global economic downturn, began to erode the empire I had spent 4 decades constructing. I stayed up late at night, staring at spreadsheets, trying to find a way to save the jobs of my 300 employees. I expected my sons to stand by me, to help me navigate the storm. Instead, I found them complaining about the reduction in their quarterly bonuses. They didn't care about the legacy. They cared about the lifestyle. When the situation became dire, and I had to sell our family estate to keep the company afloat, the mask finally began to slip. The resentment in their voices was palpable. They didn't see a father trying to save a life's work. They saw an old man who was losing their money. The breaking point came 6 months ago. I called a family meeting in the office that still smelled of my father's old cigars. I sat them down and told them the truth. "The company is in debt," I said, my voice trembling for the first time in my life. "I've poured everything into saving it, including my personal savings. I'm struggling, boys. I might have to file for bankruptcy." The silence that followed was colder than any winter I had ever experienced. Arthur didn't offer a hand on my shoulder. Leo didn't ask how I was doing. Arthur simply stood up, adjusted his expensive silk tie, and asked, "So, what's left for us?" That question cut deeper than any financial loss ever could. I looked at the 2 men I had raised and realized I didn't know them at all. They weren't worried about my well-being. They were mourning the loss of their bank account. Over the next few weeks, they stopped answering my calls. They missed Sunday dinners, and then the chest pains started. The pain in my chest that afternoon was a sharp, searing reminder of the stress I had been carrying alone. I collapsed in the very office where I had signed the papers to give my sons their first cars and their first homes. When I woke up, I was surrounded by the sterile white walls of a hospital, the hum of machines the only sound in the room. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling, and dialed Arthur first. It went straight to voicemail. Then I called Leo. He answered, but his voice was rushed, annoyed. When I told him I was in the cardiac ward, there was a long, heavy pause. He didn't ask which room I was in or if I was scared. He simply asked if I had sorted out the insurance paperwork, because he didn't want the bills falling on his shoulders now that the business was in the red. He promised to come by later, but later never came. That night, I realized that the sons I had pampered had no room in their hearts for a father who was no longer a source of income. For the next 3 days, I watched the door of my hospital room every time it creaked open, hoping to see a familiar face. Instead, it was always a nurse or a doctor with more bad news. My condition was stable, but the stress had taken a permanent toll on my heart. I felt like a discarded tool, something that had been used until it was blunt and then tossed into the trash. The nurses would ask if there was anyone they should call, any family who should be updated on my progress. I had to lie. I told them my sons were busy running the international branches of the company, that they were important men with important responsibilities. It was a lie to protect my own pride, but deep down it was a lie to protect the image of the children I still desperately wanted to love. I was a man who had everything, yet I was dying in a room full of strangers, more alone than a beggar on the street. The betrayal grew deeper when a lawyer I had worked with for years came to visit me, not out of friendship, but to deliver a message. My sons had already begun the process of filing for legal separation from the remaining assets of the company. They were trying to distance themselves from the debt, essentially leaving me to drown in the legal and financial fallout alone. They weren't just abandoning me physically, they were erasing my name from the world they still wanted to inhabit. As I read the documents Arthur had sent through a third party, I felt a coldness settle in my bones that no blanket could warm. They had calculated my worth down to the penny and decided that I was a liability. All those years of "I love you, Dad," and "thank you for everything" were just currency they traded for the things I could provide. Now that the bank was empty, their love had expired. I spent those long nights in the hospital, reflecting on where I had gone wrong. I had thought that by providing a life without struggle, I was giving them the ultimate gift. I realized too late that struggle is what builds character, and by removing every obstacle from their paths, I had raised men who didn't know how to be strong for anyone but themselves. I had built a house of cards, and the first gust of wind had blown it all away. I remembered the birthdays I missed because I was working to buy them the latest gadgets. The anniversaries I spent in boardrooms to ensure their trust funds were overflowing. I had sacrificed the time that builds a soul for the money that buys a mask. And now, the mask had slipped, revealing 2 vultures waiting for the old lion to stop breathing so they could pick at the remains. By the second week, the doctors told me I could be discharged, but I had nowhere to go. The family home had been sold, and the apartment I was renting was a lonely, quiet box. I called Leo one last time. I told him I needed help getting home, that I wasn't strong enough to carry my own bags or navigate the stairs. He told me he was at a gallery opening and that he'd send a car service. "A car service, Leo? I'm your father," I whispered into the phone. He sighed, a sound of pure exasperation. "Dad, we've already talked about this. We have our own lives to live. You can't keep dragging us down with your problems." He hung up before I could tell him that I didn't want his money. I just wanted him to hold my hand for 5 minutes. That was the moment the father in me died, and something else took its place. A spark of the old fire, the one that built the empire, flickered back to life. If they wanted to treat me like a stranger, then I would show them what a stranger was capable of. I walked out of the hospital on shaky legs, but my mind was clearer than it had ever been. The car service Leo sent to pick me up was a final insult. A stranger driving, not a single word of concern, not a single touch from a family member. Sitting in the back seat, watching the bustling crowds through the glass, I realized I had spent my entire life building a future for people who didn't respect the past. My rented apartment was small and smelled of dust, a far cry from the magnificent mansion I once owned, but in this silence, I began to plan. I was no longer the grieving father waiting for pity. I was returning to the man who had once defeated dozens of competitors to rise to the top. My first step was not to reclaim money, but to reclaim the dignity I had lost by overindulging my children. I began by contacting old connections, friends I hadn't called in years because I was too busy with family and business. It turned out that although my assets were depleted, my reputation and intellect were still valuable. I reunited with Mr. Harris, an old rival but now a respected old friend. When he heard my story, he didn't look at me with pity but with bitter understanding. He told me something I will never forget. How? You taught them how to spend money, but you never taught them how to earn it or how to be human. That sentence was like a slap in the face, but it was the truth. I decided that the final lesson I would give Arthur and Leo would be the most expensive one they would ever have to learn. The price of betrayal and the true value of hard work. While I worked quietly to restore a small part of my consulting business, I kept minimal contact with my sons to observe them. Arthur was trying to maintain a flashy appearance by borrowing everywhere, believing my old name was still enough to guarantee new loans. Leo was drowning in lavish parties, spending the last of the money from the trust fund I had set up for him 10 years ago. They thought I had completely collapsed, that this old man was just waiting for the end so they could fully shrug off their responsibility. They had no idea that every wrong move they made was under my watch. I saw Arthur starting to sell the watch collections I had given him, and Leo starting to be rejected by elite clubs because of massive debts. One evening, Arthur came to my small apartment. He didn't come to check on my health after my heart surgery. He came because he was in big trouble with a creditor and needed me to sign a guarantee for a ghost real estate project he was pursuing. Looking at my son standing there, in an expensive suit, but with eyes full of cunning and desperation, I felt an infinite sadness. He still thought I was a money tree he could shake at any time. When I refused, his true face revealed itself once again. He shouted, saying I was a selfish father, that I was ruining his future just because I was sulking about what happened at the hospital. He said my bankruptcy was already an insult to the family name. I sat in silence, letting the insults pour out. When he was tired and stopped, I just said softly, "You're right, Arthur. I failed in educating you both, but I still have time to fix that mistake." He laughed mockingly, thinking I was talking nonsense because of old age. He left, slamming the door, leaving me in the dark with a steely determination. I knew what I had to do. I wouldn't just watch them destroy themselves. I would accelerate that process so they would have to face the grim reality of life without my protection. I began gathering evidence of the financial irregularities Arthur had committed while working at the old company and Leo's secret gambling debts. My health gradually stabilized thanks to a simple diet and a mind with a clear goal. I no longer needed five-star hotels or grand parties to feel alive. Every morning I woke up, exercised in the nearby park, and worked on my old laptop. I started writing a memoir, not about success, but about the bitterest failures of a father. I wanted the world to know that true wealth does not lie in a bank account, but in the values we pass on to the next generation. Meanwhile, Arthur and Leo began to feel the pressure. The doors that were always wide open to them because of my name began to close. Their close friends disappeared quickly when bills went unpaid. Everything began to crumble for them, faster than I expected. Arthur was investigated for document fraud, and Leo was sued for failing to pay massive personal debts. They came to me again, but this time not with a superior attitude, but with panic. They knocked on my door on a rainy night, soaked and trembling. They begged me to use my last connections to save them. I looked at my two sons, the people I had loved more than my own life. and saw two strangers afraid of their own shadows. I invited them in, made them each a cup of hot tea, but this time I didn't give them a check or a promise of help. I handed them a job application for an old mechanical workshop owned by an acquaintance. "This is the only place you can start over," I said. Leo threw the paper on the floor, and Arthur looked at me as if I had gone mad. They didn't understand that this was the last chance for them to become real men. They left in anger, cursing me as a cold-blooded father. But I wasn't sad. I knew that the lesson of survival only truly begins when a person has no way back. I stood by the window, watching their figures disappear in the rain, my heart feeling light. I had finished the job of a father who always protects. Now it was time to perform the duty of a strict teacher. The betrayal at the hospital that day had cut the last string of weakness in me. The following weeks were a masterclass in the silence of consequences. After my sons stormed out of my apartment, rejecting the honest labor I offered, they truly began to experience the world without the safety net of my name. I didn't have to lift a finger to destroy them. Their own habits and the expectations I had incorrectly fostered in them did the work for me. Arthur, in his desperation to maintain his status, attempted to forge my signature on a series of promissory notes to satisfy a group of predatory lenders. He thought the old man was too weak to notice or too soft to react. He was wrong. When the bank called to verify the documents, I didn't cover for him as I would have in the past. I simply told the truth. I did not sign those papers. The silence on the other end of the line was the sound of a trap door closing. Leo's downfall was less legal, but equally devastating. Without his allowance or the ability to charge his lifestyle to the company credit cards, he was evicted from his luxury penthouse. I watched from a distance, not out of malice, but out of a painful necessity, as his friends, the influencers and socialites he had spent thousands on, refused to even let him sleep on their couches. He called me, his voice cracking, complaining that he was staying in a cheap motel where the walls were thin and the water was cold. He expected me to be horrified. He expected me to rush over with a credit card and an apology. Instead, I told him, "Leo, millions of people live like that every day and find a way to be happy. Perhaps it is time you find out how they do it." He hung up on me, but for the first time I didn't feel the urge to call back. While they were sinking, I was rising, albeit in a different way. My consulting business began to gain traction. I wasn't making millions, but I was making enough to be comfortable and, more importantly, to be proud. I moved into a slightly larger apartment, one with a view of the park where I walked every morning. I began to consult for small startups, young entrepreneurs who reminded me of myself 40 years ago. They had the fire, the hunger, and the ethics that my sons lacked. It was therapeutic to mentor these young people. It felt like I was planting seeds in a garden that might actually bloom, unlike the wasteland I had cultivated in my own home. I realized that my son's betrayal hadn't just been about money. It was about the death of a dream I had forced upon them. They were never meant to be my successors. They were just the recipients of my guilt for being a workaholic father. However, the shadow of the hospital stayed with me. Every time I felt a flutter in my chest, I was reminded of that lonely night when neither of them came. That memory became my shield. One afternoon, Arthur's wife, Sarah, came to see me. She was a woman I had always liked, sensible, kind, and far too good for my eldest son. She was crying, telling me that Arthur was facing jail time and that their children were scared. She begged me to pay for a high-profile lawyer. "He's your son," she pleaded. "You can't let him go to prison." I looked at her, and my heart broke for my grandchildren. But I knew that if I stepped in now, Arthur would never learn. If I saved him today, he would only commit a bigger crime tomorrow, confident that Dad would always be there to clean up the mess. "Sarah," I said, holding her hands, "if I pay for that lawyer, I am not helping him. I am enabling the man who left me to die in a hospital bed because I couldn't pay his bills. Arthur needs to face the man in the mirror. He needs to realize that his actions have real-world consequences that no amount of money can erase." She left in tears, and for a moment, I felt like the monster they accused me of being. But then I looked at the photos on my wall, photos of a younger me, working in that greasy workshop, and I remembered that I only became the man I am because I had to face my own struggles. I was finally giving Arthur the gift of accountability, even if it arrived in the form of a prison cell. Leo, meanwhile, had reached rock bottom. He was spotted working as a delivery driver, a job he considered beneath him, but his only means of survival. I heard through the grapevine that he was struggling, losing weight, and finally understanding the value of a single dollar. This was the most difficult part of my plan, the waiting. I wanted to reach out, to buy him a meal, to tell him I was proud of him for finally working. But I knew the moment I showed weakness, he would revert to the person he was. I had to remain the cold-blooded father until the transformation was complete. I was no longer interested in their inheritance. I was interested in their redemption. As the months passed, the legal case against Arthur intensified. The evidence I had gathered regarding his earlier embezzlements within my own company, evidence I had initially planned to burn to protect him, was now in the hands of the prosecutors. I hadn't turned it in myself, but I hadn't hidden it when the subpoenas arrived. Watching my son being led into a courtroom in handcuffs on the evening news was the hardest thing I have ever endured. My heart screamed to go to him, but my mind stayed firm. He looked into the camera, and for the first time in his life, I didn't see arrogance. I saw a profound, terrifying realization. The world did not belong to him. He was just a man, and he was alone. The trial of my eldest son was a spectacle that the media devoured. They called it the Fall of the Dynasty, a headline that mocked everything I had spent my life building. I sat in the back of the courtroom during the sentencing, wearing a simple suit, blending into the crowd like a ghost of the man I used to be. Arthur scanned the room, his eyes frantic, searching for the powerful allies he thought he still had. When his gaze finally landed on me, he didn't see a savior. He saw a mirror. I didn't look away. I wanted him to see the cost of his choices reflected in my steady, unforgiving gaze. When the judge handed down a sentence of 5 years, Arthur's legs gave out. As the bailiffs led him away, he screamed my name, not in love, but in a desperate, ugly rage. He called me a traitor. He cursed the day I was born. But, as the heavy doors closed behind him, the silence that followed was the first moment of peace I had felt in years. While Arthur was entering a cell, Leo was entering a different kind of purgatory. He had lost everything: his car, his designer wardrobe, and the last of his pride. One evening, as I was leaving my small consulting office, I saw a figure leaning against a street lamp. It was Leo. He looked unrecognizable. His hair was unkempt, his clothes were worn, and the arrogance that once defined his posture had been replaced by a weary slouch. He didn't ask for money this time. He just stood there, looking at me with eyes that finally seemed to see the world as it really was. "I'm hungry, Dad," he whispered. It was the first time in years he had called me Dad instead of the old man or CEO. I took him to a small, quiet diner nearby. Not a 5-star restaurant, but a place where the coffee was hot and the food was honest. We sat in a booth in the corner, the steam from our plates rising between us like a veil. I watched him eat with a desperation that broke my heart, yet I remained firm. I told him about the workshop job I had offered him months ago. I told him the offer was still on the table, but it would be on his merit alone. No special treatment, no executive title, just a wrench and a paycheck that would barely cover a room in a boarding house. Leo looked at his hands that had never known a callus or a stain of grease, and he began to cry. Not the loud, performative crying of a child who wants a toy, but the quiet, shaking sobs of a man who realized he had wasted the first 30 years of his life. "Why didn't you stop us, Dad?" he asked between breaths. "Why did you let us become like this?" It was a question that haunted me. I took a sip of my coffee and looked him straight in the eye. Because I loved you more than I respected you, I replied. I thought that by protecting you from the world, I was being a good father. I didn't realize I was raising you to be prey for the first predator that came along, and in this case, the predator was your own greed. We sat there for a long time after the plates were cleared. I didn't give him a ride. I didn't give him $100 bill. I gave him the address of the workshop and a time to show up. If you're there at 7 a.m., you have a future, I said. If you aren't, then you've made your choice. I walked away, leaving him in that diner, knowing that the next 12 hours would decide whether I had one son left or none. The next morning, I drove by the workshop at 5 minutes past 7. I didn't stop, but I saw him. Leo was standing by the gate, shivering in the morning chill, waiting for the owner to arrive. A surge of pride, more powerful than any business success, swept through me. It was a small step, a tiny flickering candle in a vast darkness, but it was a start. For the next few months, I stayed away. I heard reports from the workshop owner, an old friend named Silas. He told me Leo was slow, that he complained and that he wanted to quit every single day. But Silas followed my instructions. He didn't give in. He pushed Leo. He made him clean the floors. He made him organize the heavy parts, and he paid him exactly what he earned. Back in my own life, my memoir was nearing completion. I had titled it, The Inheritance of Nothing. It wasn't just my story. It was a manifesto for a generation of parents who were losing their children to the vacuum of luxury. My health continued to improve, my heart growing stronger not just from the medication, but from the shedding of the weight of my son's expectations. I realized that my struggle for survival wasn't just about money. It was about the survival of my soul. I had been a prisoner to my own success for decades, and the bankruptcy, the illness, and even the abandonment in the hospital were the keys that had finally set me free. I was no longer a struggling man. I was a man who had finally found his footing on the solid ground of reality. But as Leo struggled to rebuild and Arthur sat in his cell, a new shadow began to loom. A group of former business associates, the ones who had profited from my son's incompetence and my own downfall, realized that I was making a comeback. They didn't want a reformed, wise version of me back in the market. They liked the version of the family that was broken and defeated. They began to exert pressure, threatening to expose Arthur's past mistakes to even harsher legal scrutiny if I didn't shut down my consulting firm and disappear. They thought they could use my love for my sons against me one more time. They didn't realize that the man they were dealing with now was not the same man who had collapsed in his office. I was a man who had already lost everything. And that made me the most dangerous person they would ever encounter. The threats from my former associates arrived in the form of thick, cream-colored envelopes and anonymous phone calls that vibrated with malice. They were the vultures who had circled the carcass of my company, picking off the pieces my sons had carelessly dropped. Now, seeing me regain my strength, they were afraid. They threatened to leak new evidence that could double Arthur's prison sentence and ensure Leo would never find work in this city again. They expected me to crumble. They expected the old father to come out and beg for mercy to protect his offspring. But as I sat in my small office, the city lights reflecting in my eyes, I realized they were using an old map to navigate a new territory. The man who could be blackmailed by his children's reputation died in that hospital bed. I decided to go on the offensive. Instead of hiding, I invited the ringleader of this group, a man named Julian, whom I had once considered a protege, to meet me at the same Greasy Spoon diner where I had shared a meal with Leo. Julian arrived looking out of place in his $3,000 suit, his nose wrinkled at the smell of burnt coffee and cheap oil. He sat across from me with a smug grin, sliding a folder across the table. "You're making a mistake, Howe," he said, his voice oily. "You're building something new, sure, but it's built on sand. One word from us, and your sons become the villains of every newspaper in the country again. Is your ego worth their complete destruction? I didn't even open the folder. I leaned forward, my face inches from his. Julian, you think you're threatening me with their destruction. What you don't understand is that they were already destroyed. I watched them rot from the inside out for years while they lived in luxury. If you release those papers, you're just giving them more of the truth. And the truth is the only thing that can save them now. Julian's smile faltered. He wasn't prepared for a father who wasn't afraid of his children's shame. I continued, "Go ahead, publish it all. But while you're doing that, remember that I spent 40 years in the belly of the beast. I know where every body is buried in your firm too. If we're going to burn things down, Julian, I promise you, I can make the fire much hotter than you can." The meeting ended in a tense silence. Julian left without his folder, and I felt a surge of adrenaline I hadn't felt in a decade. I wasn't fighting for a stock price anymore. I was fighting for the right to live an honest life. I went to visit Arthur in prison the following day. It was the first time I had seen him since the sentencing. Behind the glass partition, he looked different. The polished veneer was gone. He looked tired, his hands were rough from the manual labor he was assigned in the laundry, and his eyes were hollow. I expected him to scream at me again, to blame me for his predicament, but instead he just stared at me for a long time before picking up the phone. "I heard about the threats, Dad," he said, his voice raspy. My heart skipped a beat. Even in prison, the grapevine was fast. "Julian's people came to see me. They told me if I didn't get you to stop, they'd make sure I stayed in here for a long time." I waited for the "please help me, Dad." But Arthur surprised me. He looked at his scarred knuckles and then back at me. "Don't stop. I deserve to be here for what I did to the company, but I won't let them use me to hurt you anymore. Tell them to do their worst. I'm already at the bottom. There's nowhere else to fall." Tears pricked my eyes. It wasn't the apology I had dreamed of, but it was something better. It was the birth of a backbone. Meanwhile, Silas called me from the workshop. "Your boy is a pain in the neck," he grumbled, though I could hear a hint of respect in his voice. "He's slow, and he broke a pneumatic drill yesterday, 'cause he didn't listen to instructions, but," he paused, "he stayed 2 hours late to fix it on his own time. He didn't ask to be paid for the overtime. He just wanted to get it right." I hung up the phone and sat in the dark, laughing and crying at the same time. The empire was gone, the mansions were sold, and my name was dragged through the mud. But for the first time in my life, I was seeing my sons grow into men. The struggle I had feared for them was the very thing that was saving them. I spent the next month working double shifts on my consulting projects, using the money to set up a small educational fund for my grandchildren. I wanted to make sure they had a future, but one that was earned, not handed out. I met with Sarah, Arthur's wife, and we talked about the children's school and the way forward. She told me Leo had been coming over on his one day off to help her with repairs around the house, something he would have hired a dozen contractors for in the past. He was showing up. He was becoming a brother and an uncle. The betrayal at the hospital was becoming a distant, painful memory, replaced by a new, rugged reality. I began to realize that my struggle for survival was actually a mission of restoration. I hadn't been left to die. I had been left to wake up. The legal war with Julian and his associates reached a boiling point just as my memoir was released. They attempted to bury the book with lawsuits, but their desperate moves only served to highlight the truth I was telling. The public, who had once viewed me as a fallen tycoon, began to see me as a man who had survived a different kind of shipwreck. The book became a sensation, not for its gossip, but for its raw honesty about the failure of a father. While the royalties began to flow in, I didn't use them to return to my old life of luxury. I stayed in my small apartment, kept my modest car, and continued to visit Silas's workshop every Friday. Not to talk to Leo, but just to watch from the shadows as he wiped grease from his forehead and navigated the realities of a hard day's work. Julian eventually made his move, releasing a series of doctored emails that suggested I had been the one to authorize Arthur's illegal activities years ago. The media swarmed my apartment once more, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions about my integrity. For a moment, it felt like the hospital all over again, the world closing in on me, waiting for me to succumb to the weight of it all. But this time, I wasn't alone. As I stepped out of my building to face the press, a beat-up truck pulled up to the curb. Leo stepped out, still in his work uniform, his hands stained with the indelible ink of a mechanic. He didn't look like a spoiled heir. He looked like a shield. He walked up to the microphones, standing beside me, and spoke with a clarity I hadn't heard from him in my entire life. "My father didn't destroy this family," Leo told the cameras, his voice steady. "We did. My brother and I were blinded by the wealth he gave us, and we were the ones who betrayed his trust. Anything Julian says is a lie born of fear, because for the first time, we are learning what it means to be honest men. If you want to talk about crimes, look at the people who are trying to blackmail a man who just had heart surgery." The reporters were stunned. The image of the abandoned father was being replaced by a family that was finally, painfully, beginning to heal. That night, for the first time in over a year, Leo stayed for dinner at my apartment, Sean. We didn't eat expensive steak. We had a simple stew I had prepared on my small stove. The conversation wasn't about business or money. He told me about a car engine he had successfully rebuilt that afternoon, describing the way the metal felt beneath his fingers and the satisfaction of hearing the machine roar back to life. I saw a spark in his eyes that I had never seen when he was buying a Ferrari or a Rolex. It was the spark of achievement. "Dad," he said, looking around the small room, "I used to think this place was a prison you moved into. Because you failed, now I see it's the first place you were ever actually free." I realized then that my sons had needed to lose me and everything I represented to find themselves. The abandonment at the hospital hadn't been an end. It had been a necessary death of the old way of life. By leaving me, they had forced me to find my own strength, and by refusing to save them, I had forced them to find theirs. However, the path ahead was still long. Arthur was still behind bars, and the legal battle with Julian was draining what little resources I had left. But I felt a strange sense of exhilaration. I was no longer a victim of my circumstances. I was the architect of a new kind of legacy, one built on the bedrock of character, rather than the shifting sands of fortune. A few days later, I received a letter from Arthur. It was the first time he had written to me without a lawyer's influence. In it, he didn't ask for a better cell or money for the canteen. He wrote about the men he was meeting in prison. Men who had never had a father like me. Men who had been born into the struggle I had tried so hard to protect him from. He admitted that he had been a coward, and that the struggle I was going through was the only thing that had made him stop and look at himself. He asked for a copy of my book, not to see his name in print, but to understand the father he had ignored for 30 years. I sat on my balcony, the letter in my hand, and looked out at the city I had once thought I owned. I didn't own the buildings or the businesses anymore, but I finally owned my life. The final confrontation with Julian came in a boardroom, but this time it was his board, not mine. I had used my consulting connections to gather enough evidence of his own money laundering to bring his entire operation down. I sat across from him, the same way I had at the diner, but this time I wasn't alone. I had a team of young lawyers who were working for me, pro bono, inspired by the story I had shared with the world. I laid the evidence on the table, not with anger, but with a cold, surgical precision. "I'm not here for revenge, Julian," I said. "I'm here for a settlement. You drop the lies about my family, you pay back the employees you defrauded when my company collapsed, and you walk away from this industry forever. Or, we go to the authorities right now." Julian stared at the documents, his face draining of color until he looked like a ghost trapped in a luxury chair. He had spent his life betting on the idea that every man has a price, or at the very least, a breaking point. He didn't understand that once you have sat in a hospital bed waiting for sons who never come, you no longer have a breaking point. You only have a purpose. He tried to bluster, to threaten one last time, but the fire in his eyes had gone out. He signed the agreement. As I walked out of that skyscraper for the final time, I didn't feel the rush of power I used to feel. I felt a profound sense of relief. The ghosts of my past were finally being laid to rest, and the road ahead, though modest, was finally clear. I used the settlement money to do something I should have done decades ago. I didn't buy a new car or move back to the hills. I bought the mechanical workshop from Silas. He was getting old and wanted to retire to the coast, and I wanted to ensure that Leo had a place where he could continue to build his soul. When I handed Leo the keys, I didn't give them to him as a gift. I gave them to him as a loan. "You will pay me back every cent out of the profits of this shop," I told him, "and you will work 10 hours a day until the debt is settled." Leo didn't complain. He took the keys, looked at the grease-stained floor of the garage, and smiled. He was no longer a prince in a fake kingdom. He was a builder in a real one. With the shop secured and the legal battles over, my life settled into a rhythm that was quiet but deeply fulfilling. I became a regular visitor at the prison where Arthur was serving his time. Our conversations through the glass changed. We no longer talked about appeals or legal loopholes. We talked about books, about philosophy, and about the mistakes of the past. Arthur started a tutoring program for the younger inmates, helping them earn their high school equivalency diplomas. He was using the education I had paid for, the education he had once taken for granted, to help people who had nothing. Seeing him find meaning in such a dark place was a miracle I never expected. He told me that for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he was competing with my shadow. He was finding his own light. One afternoon, a young man came to my office. He was a reporter for a major business magazine, the same one that had put me on the cover as Entrepreneur of the Year 20 years ago. He wanted to do a follow-up story, a "Where Are They Now" piece. He asked me how it felt to lose everything, the wealth, the prestige, and the loyalty of my family. I looked at the small photo on my desk of me and Leo, both covered in engine oil, standing in front of the workshop. Then I looked at the letter Arthur had sent me that morning, filled with hope for his release next year. I looked the reporter in the eye and said, "I didn't lose everything. I lost the illusions that were keeping me from seeing what I actually had. I'm richer now in this small office than I ever was in that glass tower." The reporter seemed confused, but I didn't care to explain further. Some things can only be understood through the fire of experience. I had learned that the struggle for survival isn't about the physical act of staying alive. It's about keeping your humanity intact when the world gives you every reason to let it go. My sons had abandoned me at my lowest point, and for a long time, I hated them for it. But I realize that their betrayal was the catalyst for my own salvation. If they had come to the hospital, if they had played the part of the good sons, I might have stayed in my cycle of enabling them. I might have died a wealthy man with a hollow family. Their cruelty forced me to become a person they could actually respect. As the months passed, the story of our family's fall and rise became a beacon for others. I started receiving letters from parents all over the country who were facing similar struggles with their children. They asked for advice, for a magic formula to fix their broken bonds. I told them all the same thing. Love isn't about making life easy. It's about making your children strong enough to handle life when it gets hard. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let them hit the ground. It wasn't the answer they wanted, but it was the only one that worked. My bank account was a fraction of what it once was, but my sleep was deep and my heart was steady. One evening I found myself back at the hospital where this all began. I wasn't there as a patient this time, but as a volunteer. I spent my Thursday nights sitting with elderly patients who had no visitors. I knew the weight of that silence, the way the beep of the heart monitor sounds like a countdown when you're alone. I met a man who reminded me of myself, successful, proud and devastated that his children were too busy to visit. I held his hand and told him my story. I told him that the face his children were showing him now wasn't the final one. I told him that life has a way of stripping us down so it can build us back up into something better. The seasons turned, and with them, the final layers of my old life fell away like dead leaves. Arthur's release date was approaching, and the atmosphere in our small, reconstructed family was one of quiet, nervous anticipation. He had spent his time in prison not just paying a debt to society, but paying a debt to himself. He had become a man of routine and reflection. Meanwhile, Leo's workshop was thriving. It wasn't a global conglomerate, but it was a local staple known for honesty and grit. One Saturday, I went down to the shop to find Leo teaching his nephew, Arthur's eldest son, how to change a tire. Seeing the boy's small, grease-stained hands working alongside Leo's scarred ones brought a lump to my throat. This was the legacy I had truly wanted to leave. Not just wealth, but a lineage of men who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty to provide for those they loved. During this time, I decided to take a trip back to the old corporate headquarters. I hadn't stepped foot in that district since the day of my collapse. Standing in front of the towering glass structure that used to bear my name, I felt no nostalgia, only a strange sense of detachment. The building was now occupied by a new tech firm, and young people in casual clothes hurried in and out, oblivious to the man who had laid the literal foundations of their workspace. I realized that for years I had defined my soul by the height of this building. I had thought that if I stopped growing, I would stop existing. But standing there as a nobody, a man with a modest bank account and a simple life, I felt more substantial than ever. I was no longer a shadow cast by a skyscraper. I was a human being standing in the sun. The most difficult moment came when I had to face the legal representative of the bank that had foreclosed on our family estate. They had found some personal items in a forgotten storage room. Old photo albums, my late wife's jewelry, and the hand-carved wooden horse I had made for Arthur when he was 5. As I looked through the boxes, I found a letter I had written to my sons years ago, intended to be read after my death. In it, I had expressed my hopes that they would use their wealth to change the world. Reading it now, I realized how naive I had been. I had focused so much on the wealth part of the equation that I had forgotten to teach them how to change the world. I took the letter and the wooden horse and left the rest. Those were the only things that still had value. A few weeks later, the day finally arrived. I drove to the prison gates to pick up Arthur. It was a cold, misty morning, much like the day I had left the hospital. When the small side door opened and Arthur stepped out, he wasn't carrying much. Just a box of books and the same clothes he had worn to court years ago. They hung loosely on his frame now. He looked at the horizon, took a long, deep breath of the damp air, and then his eyes found mine. There were no cameras, no lawyers, and no fanfares. He walked toward the car, his pace steady. When he reached me, he didn't shake my hand. He hugged me. It was a tight, desperate embrace that said everything the last 5 years of silence couldn't. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered into my shoulder. "I'm so sorry for everything." I didn't tell him it was okay, because it hadn't been okay, but I told him that it was over. We drove back to the city in a comfortable silence. He didn't ask about the old company or the house. He asked about Leo. He asked about his children. He asked if the workshop had an opening for someone who was good with numbers, but willing to learn the heavy lifting. I smiled, watching the city lights reflect in the rearview mirror. "Leo's been waiting for you," I said, "but don't expect him to make it easy on you. He's a tough boss." Arthur laughed, a genuine, hearty sound that I hadn't heard in a decade. It was the sound of a man who had finally found his footing. That night, we had a family dinner at my apartment. Sarah brought the kids, Leo closed the shop early, and for the first time in my life, I sat at a table where no one was looking at their phones or talking about profit margins. We talked about the future, but a future measured in days and small victories rather than fiscal quarters. My grandchildren sat on the floor, playing with the old wooden horse I had recovered. As I looked around the room at my sons, 2 men who had once abandoned me in a hospital bed but had now returned as the men I always hoped they would be, I realized that my struggle for survival was over. I hadn't just survived the betrayal. I had survived the success that had nearly destroyed us all. The face of my children was no longer a mask of greed. It was the face of redemption. The months following Arthur's return were the quietest and most beautiful of my life. We settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. Every morning my two sons would head to the workshop together, Leo to manage the floor and the grease, and Arthur to handle the books and the customer relations. They worked as a team, two brothers who had finally found a common language in the honest pursuit of a living. I watched them from the sidelines, occasionally stepping in to offer a piece of advice, but mostly I just watched. I watched the way they respected each other, and more importantly, the way they respected themselves. The empire I once built was gone, replaced by a small, thriving business that supported two families and gave me a sense of peace that no billion-dollar merger ever could. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the city skyline, we all gathered at the workshop for a small celebration. It was the day Leo and Arthur made the final payment on the loan I had given them to buy the shop. They handed me an envelope, not with a sense of obligation, but with a sense of triumph. We stood among the tools and the half-finished engines, the air smelling of oil and success. Arthur looked at me and said, "Dad, when we left you at the hospital, we thought we were being smart. We thought we were protecting our future. We didn't realize we were walking away from the only thing that actually mattered." Leo nodded in agreement, his hand on his brother's shoulder. "You had to lose everything to show us what we were missing," he added. I looked at them, my heart full, and realized that the struggle I had been so afraid of was actually the greatest gift I could have received. If I had remained wealthy, I would have died a lonely man surrounded by vultures. If I had been healthy, I would have kept working until I collapsed again, never truly knowing my sons. The betrayal, the pain, and the poverty were the tools life used to carve away the excess and reveal the truth beneath. I am not the man I was 40 years ago, and I am certainly not the man I was when I lay in that hospital bed. I am a father who finally understands that the only legacy worth leaving is the strength of character you instill in those you leave behind. As I sit here today, writing the final pages of my life's new chapter, I feel a profound sense of gratitude. My health is stable, my mind is clear, and my family is whole. We don't have the mansions or the yachts, but we have Sunday dinners where we laugh until our sides ache. We have the respect of our neighbors, and we have the knowledge that we can survive whatever the world throws at us. I often think back to that cold hospital room and the feeling of utter abandonment. It was the lowest point of my existence, but it was also the foundation upon which I built a real life. The face of betrayal has been replaced by the face of love, a love that was earned in the trenches of reality. To anyone listening to my story, I want you to remember this. Do not fear the struggle. Do not fear the moments when you feel abandoned or when the people you love let you down. Those are the moments when you find out who you really are, and more importantly, who they really are. Life has a way of stripping us down to the bone so it can see what we are made of. If you are going through a dark time, if you feel like the people you've helped have turned their backs on you, don't give up. Use that pain as fuel. Use that silence to listen to your own strength. You might lose your wealth, your status, and your comfort, but as long as you have your integrity, you have everything you need to start again. My journey from the boardroom to the hospital bed, and finally to this small, happy life, has been the hardest thing I've ever done. But I wouldn't trade a single second of the pain for all the gold in the world. I found my sons, and in the process I found myself. We are a family of survivors, and for the first time in my long life, I can truly say that I am a rich man. The beep of the heart monitor no longer sounds like a countdown. It sounds like a heartbeat, steady, strong, and full of hope for whatever tomorrow may bring. This story of betrayal and redemption is a reminder that the strongest bonds are forged in the fire of life's hardest trials. If this story moved you or gave you a new perspective on family and resilience, I hope you'll join our community. Please consider subscribing to the channel to hear more heart-touching stories like this one every day. Your support helps us keep sharing these important life lessons. Thank you for listening.